you had to sum up the entire idea of America in one sentence, I think that the preamble to the Declaration of Independence would be the best place to start. It, better than any other document in American history, distills the essential principles of what Thomas Jefferson called the American mind. What I want to do with you is read the famous preamble, and you all know it, you'll recognize it, and then let's try to unpack it and understand what it means. So here we go. Kerry, I don't know if you can easily put it on the screen, but I'm just going to start going.
And I might just have you big screen this right now, because as you read it out to them, I want everybody to be able to see and hear you read that out loud.
That's great. Can you get my screen, or do you have it on yours?
I can pull it up in just 1 second, but right now they're going to see you read it.
Okay, well, here we go.
Or hear you, I should say.
Okay. So here we go. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Wow, there's so much in those gorgeous words. But what's so striking about them is that Thomas Jefferson said they were not original. He wasn't pulling them out of thin air. He was trying to distill what he called the basic principles of the American mind. And he said he got them from great philosophers like Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, Philip Sidney, and other great thinkers of the time. So we could spend a long time talking about them, but we got a lot to go through. So let's just parse each of the sentences and make sure we understand what they mean. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is obvious. It's our powers of reason should make it clear that this is true without any further proof. That all men are created equal. Of course, Jefferson meant, in theory, all men, and that should include all women. It really should mean all human beings, because it means we're equal by virtue of the fact that we're human. But of course, we all know that there was a terrible hypocrisy at the time of the founding, and that was the existence of slavery in America. And Jefferson himself and the other founders recognized that that was a rebuke to the promise that all men are created equal. And it took the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments and finally the Civil Rights Act to make that promise a reality. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Endowed by their creator means that these rights come to us from God or nature, not from government. You may believe in God, you may believe that our rights inhere in us by virtue of the fact that we are human, but regardless, Jefferson says, our rights do not come from government, they inhere in us from God or nature because we are human beings. But then he uses a really interesting term, unalienable rights. What is an unalienable right? Some of you may remember, if you were with us at the very first classes on the First Amendment, that the framers believed that they imagine that we're all born in a state of nature. It's a kind of a thought experiment, but it was used by great philosophers like John Locke, like Francis Hutcheson, Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, and also by Cicero and the Romans that the founders relied on. And they thought that we're born with basic rights, and when we form governments, we can surrender or alienate. Alienate means surrender or turn over or relinquish certain rights in order to secure greater safety of the rights that we've retained. In other words, it's a contract, it's a bargain. I give the government certain of my rights, not completely, but I allow it to have safekeeping over those rights. In exchange, I get more security of the rights that I've retained. So what are the unalienable rights? Well, Jefferson tells us. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I can, when it comes to life, I can give government the power to punish people who threaten my life, because my life is going to be more secure if I give that power to government rather than try to engage in self-defense on my own. But my basic right to life, I retain. I have my right to liberty, which is the right to pursue my own interest as long as I don't harm or hurt others in their equal rights. And I have the right to pursue happiness. Friends, this is an amazing thing that I've just been learning. But when Thomas Jefferson talked about the pursuit of happiness, he didn't mean the right to follow your bliss or eat as much, candy as you wanted or do whatever feels good in the moment. He had in mind an idea of happiness that came from the Stoic philosophers, from the ancient Greeks and Romans. They believed that our true happiness can only be obtained by rigorous self-mastery, by mastering our thoughts. They called them perturbations of the mind. And they said, remember, this is a time of pandemics and smallpox and death and disasters. And they thought there's so much we can't control in our lives. The only thing we can control is our thoughts. And by mastering our unreasonable passions like anger, grief, and fear, we can achieve tranquility and calm that will allow us to welcome and accept whatever fortune throws in our path and to maintain that tranquility. And that virtue, they thought, was the definition of happiness. It's not a familiar definition. It's not what we think of today, but it's very inspiring, especially in the time of the coronavirus. Okay, we still have more to get through and we have so many documents, but
yeah, there's one more point, and you pulled it out, but I just want to resonate it a little bit more, is this idea of popular sovereignty is baked into the Declaration of Independence, and it starts to come out that people have a voice over their government. Can you take a beat on that as well?
That's so crucial, Kerry, and you're absolutely right. That's what the whole rest of the sentence is talking about. It's by the fact that we're all born equal that we can't be anyone else's servant. We can't allow someone else to control our thoughts because we can't entirely control them ourselves, and we can't alienate or give anyone else total power over our liberty. We can't subject ourselves to a tyrant or king. When we form governments, those governments are based on our consent. And that's why the sentence goes on to say that to secure these rights, it's in order to ensure that we actually keep these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Kerry, I'm so glad you emphasized that idea of popular.
You know how I love John Locke.
And this is from John Locke. But the idea of the pursuit of happiness was more from Aristotle, Cicero, and Scottish thinkers, but this idea of our power from the consent of the governed comes from John Locke as well. And then John Locke goes on to say in this his famous book, the Second Treatise of Government, we're making a bargain with government. We say, hey, government, you can have temporary control of our rights as long as you secure the rights we retain. But whenever government breaks the bargain, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it. In other words, the right of revolution, which is the right that Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration signers are asserting here, is itself an unalienable right. It's basically our way of ensuring that the government keeps its end of the bargain. And if government doesn't and threatens our retained rights, we have the right and in fact the duty to alter and abolish it and to institute new government that will actually ensure that we secure and obtain safety and happiness. It's amazing, isn't it? Just so much packed into that one sentence. And you really can say that all the other documents we're going to be talking about today, from the Constitution to the Bill of Rights, to the Federalist Papers, even to all the way up to Martin Luther King's great letter from the Birmingham Jail, all which invokes the Declaration, all are expressions or manifestations of the brilliant but powerfully simple ideas contained in those words. Okay, Kerry, how do we do?
I think we're doing great. I just wanted to pull out Teddy's question because I thought it was a really good question from Teddy. And it was, does the pursuit of happiness include liberty?
Great question. And the answer is yes, because our liberty, remember, our liberty is unalienable. So the founders believed we can only achieve happiness by practicing a life of virtue. And they understood virtue to mean the exercise of our powers of reason to try to discern the truth. And we can only exercise our powers of reason if we have the liberty to exercise our powers of reason. So if the king is going to throw us in jail for saying that we think that he's bad, or if we're going to get punished if we don't take the kind of religion that everyone else is abiding by, then we can't exercise our powers of reason. That's why the rights of conscience, or the liberty, Teddy, of conscience, you're so right to stress liberty as the central idea of the unalienable right. Our liberty of conscience is unalienable because I can't give you the power to control my thoughts. I can't entirely control them myself. They're the product of my reason. And therefore, I cannot command myself or anyone else, including you, Teddy, to think as I please. So it's all based on this powerful notion of reason, that we have to be free to, we have to have the liberty to follow our reason wherever it leads, as long as that doesn't harm others in the equal exercise of their powers of reason and their liberty. And that is why liberty is unalienable, and it is crucial to the achievement of the pursuit of happiness. Great question.
Awesome. Okay. And we're going to save a lot of these questions towards the end, just because we do have a lot of documents to get through, and I'm going to keep it moving. So Articles of Confederation. Jeff, could you give us a little beat on how did we get here, and maybe some of the flaws of the Articles as well when you explain this document?
Yes, the Articles of Confederation were the first effort by the American colonies to form a common government. Remember, around the time of the Declaration, the individual colonies, which are now states, were considered sovereign, and Virginia had its own constitution and Declaration of Rights, so did Massachusetts, so did all the 13 colonies. But they found they needed some common government because they needed to have commerce and exchange and trade, and they also needed to defend themselves against foreign threats. So they formed this union called the Articles of Confederation. But the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it was extremely weak. The states were so determined to keep their own sovereignty, to ensure that they weren't threatened by a newly tyrannical central government, that they called these articles a League of Friendship. They came into force in 1781, but they had a lot of flaws. First of all, any proposed amendment required unanimous consent from all 13 colonies. Everyone had to agree. So as a result, there were no amendments ratified, even though there were obvious problems with the articles that had to be fixed. One of the biggest problems was that Congress, which is the common body under the articles, can't declare war, can't enter into treaties, it can't appropriate money or appoint a commander-in-chief without 9 states approving. And as a result, when George Washington is fighting the Revolutionary War, there's no money for his troops at Valley Forge. If you've seen movies about George Washington or read about him, he's always writing to the Congress saying, please send me money. My soldiers have no shoes. Their feet are freezing. They're starving. And because the Articles of Confederation create such a weak central government, Congress is not able to act during the Revolutionary War or even after the war when it comes into effect in 1781. And also Congress lacks the power to regulate commerce between the states. So combined with the lack of a taxing power, this means the states keep stopping each other from sending their goods into one state. There were tax disputes between New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. And the biggest drama that resulted from the Articles of Confederation is that there were the lack of the ability to tax resulted in something called Shays' Rebellion, which is where a bunch of debtors, people who owed money, were so angry at the fact that they couldn't pay back the money and the governments wouldn't raise taxes to help pay the debts, that they storm the courthouse and have protests and threaten not to pay their debts. Did you see this morning, friends, in Michigan, some people with guns went to the Michigan legislature and said, we want you to open up after the quarantine. Some people have compared that, which happened today, to Shays' Rebellion, a group of citizens with guns basically saying our liberty is being threatened. Now, the founders were so alarmed by the prospect of citizens taking up guns in order not to obey the rule of law that they said, my goodness, we need to change these Articles of Confederation so that we have a government strong enough to achieve common purposes like raising taxes and declaring war, but constrained enough so that it doesn't threaten liberty. Back to Teddy's question, the unalienable liberties that are retained. And that was what led Congress to summon the Constitutional Convention and led to the ratification of the Constitution.
Awesome. Perfect. And that's crazy. I did not hear that that happened today. So, and Shays' Rebellion is a huge thing that the students need to learn about. So, you know, as they're thinking about using references from these documents, Articles of Confederation, Shays' Rebellion, and Modern Times, that could help in the essays as well, and insane to hear that that happened today. So next, Jeff, do we want to jump? Because I know we'll spend a lot of time on this one,
Yeah.
the Constitution.
Well, you know, of course, everything we teach and talk about, friends, in these courses and at the National Constitution Center is about the Constitution. So I think, in fact, we shouldn't, you know, spend all of our time talking about it, because everything has to do with the Constitution. But the big point to say here is that the Constitution was supposed to avoid the Articles, the dangers of the Articles of Confederation. And on February 21st, 1787, the Confederation Congress calls a convention of state delegates to meet in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles. But the delegates had different plans. They wanted to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and preservation of the Union. Now, here is what's amazing. There's so many things that are amazing about the Constitution. Every aspect of it is amazing. It was a miracle. People have talked about it as the miracle of Philadelphia. How is it possible that these fallible human beings created the greatest document of human freedom in history? But as we think about the relation between the Declaration and the Constitution, it's striking that the Constitution was technically illegal. Because remember, the Articles of Confederation said that any amendment or change had to be unanimously ratified by all 13 states. But the Constitution set up a different ratification procedure. It said that only 2/3 of the states were necessary for the new Constitution to go into effect. How is it possible that you could have an illegal Constitution? Why should we obey it today if it was illegal? Well, it's because the framers thought that they were reverting to the state of nature that Thomas Jefferson described in the Declaration of Independence, and exercising their unalienable right to alter and abolish government whenever government is inadequate to the task of preserving life, liberty, and property. So if the right to alter and abolish government is an unalienable right from God or nature, it doesn't matter that the Articles of Confederation tried to say you can only do it this way. They're reverting to the original state and asserting their natural right to alter and abolish government. Here's one other thing to say about the Constitution. Who was the people exercising their sovereign rights to ratify the Constitution? The Constitution begins, of course, with the words, "We the people of the United States." But the first draft of the Constitution didn't contain those words. We have at the Constitution Center the very first draft of the Constitution. It is so inspiring. I can't wait to get back to the Constitution Center so I can see it. But the original words were, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantation," and so forth, do ordain and establish. So initially, the framers were thinking of themselves as a collection, a union of sovereign states, as under the Articles of Confederation. But a very great framer, who you may not have heard about, but I'd love you to learn more about, because he was one of the underappreciated geniuses of the convention. His name was James Wilson of Pennsylvania. He believed that we, the people of the United States as a whole, have the sovereign power, and that's why the language was changed in the final draft to "We, the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. So this becomes very significant when it comes to the Civil War, because when certain southern states try to secede from the Union, to leave it, they say, "We're sovereign, we entered it, we can leave it whenever we want." President Lincoln said, "No, you can't." The framers, like James Wilson, believed that since we, the people of the whole Union, created the Constitution, a majority of the whole people would be necessary to change it or to alter and abolish the Constitution, and that's why he denied the constitutional power of the South to secede and took the Civil War to settle that question. Kerry, anything else you want to tease out about the Constitution before we talk about the Bill of Rights?
A few things real quick. So one group of questions on the Constitutional Convention itself, and then a few other structural questions, just because I know that kids need to go over these topics too. So real quickly, there were a lot of compromises at the Constitutional Convention. I missed this room, Jeff, Signers Hall, the moment of the signing of the Constitution. One of them was the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. Could you talk a little bit about the Connecticut Compromise, the Electoral College, and then some of the ones that we can consider these great stains on the Constitution, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the compromise of the importation of enslaved people. So real quickly, can you go through those big pieces, just so the kids, as they understand putting this great document together, what are the things that they did to move it forward that, we may now look back and say could be some of our like original sins of our Constitution?
Yes, those are crucial questions. Thank you for asking them, and friends, thank you for asking them as well. So the first big fissure or debate over in the Constitution was between the big states and the small states. It was all about power, right? And the big states said, we want to have representation based on population, because most of the people are in our states, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, the same states that are pretty big today were big then, and they wanted to base representation in Congress on population. The smaller states, Delaware, at the time, New Jersey, thought, gosh, if it's based on population, we're going to lose all the votes. So we want to have some other mechanism. We like the idea of 2 representatives for every state, regardless of how big they are. So what did the delegates do? As Kerry said, the Connecticut Compromise, I can almost see Kerry, Roger Sherman right behind you. Roger Sherman was—
Let me get out of the way.
He's on the other side. But
I have so much trouble with the dyslexia. It pops out with these virtual rooms so badly.
No, you leaned in the right direction.
Okay, good.
But we can't quite see Sherman, but he's almost there. And he was from Connecticut, and he said, let's mix both systems. In the House, we'll have representation by population. In the Senate, every state will get 2 senators, regardless of how big it is. And that is the way we will accommodate the interests of the big states and the small states. So that was the Connecticut Compromise, and it shows the crucial blending of these 2 interests. Then, friends, you asked about the Electoral College. How should we elect the president? Now, James Wilson, that hero of popular sovereignty, who thought we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign, wanted to have direct popular election of the president. Whoever gets the most votes should be president. Sounds pretty simple? Well, yes, it is. And that's what he wanted. But some folks didn't like that. The smaller states, again, were afraid they might get swamped. And there was also a concern about demagogues who would flatter the people and lead to dictators who might take away liberty. So the compromise they came up with was the Electoral College. In the end, Wilson supported it, although it wasn't his first choice. And the Electoral College was a very complicated system that says that people vote not directly for president, but for electors who will ultimately vote for president. And the electors are apportioned based on the population of the states and the number of representatives they have in Congress. So the bigger states get more electoral votes than the smaller states. The original idea of the Electoral College was that you'd vote for a delegate or an elector, and that person would exercise independent judgment, because he would know, and they were he's then, better than the people who the best candidates were. So they could pick, everyone knew the first president was going to be George Washington. There was never any doubt about that. But after Washington stepped down, they would pick whoever was most like Washington rather than some designing, ambitious demagogue like Aaron Burr, who narrowly lost the election of 1800 in a case where the Electoral College tied. Now, the tie of the Electoral College in 1800 was so traumatic to everyone, and the election was decided by a single vote, that it led to the 12th Amendment, which changed the system for choosing electors so that you no longer had presidents and vice presidents running basically against each other, so that the first vote winner became president and the second place winner became vice president, to avoid the possibility that you might have a president and a vice president from different political parties. And in recognition of the new rise of political parties, the framers changed the Electoral College system so that only someone from the same party could become president. That's the Electoral College. It's much debated today. 4 times in American history, the loser of the popular vote has won the Electoral College, most recently in 2016 with President Trump, before that with George W. Bush, and before that we had the Tilden Hayes election and also the Grover Cleveland Harrison election. But the chances of amending the Electoral College are not high, because in order to get an amendment, you'd have to get the small states to agree, and they're unlikely to do so because they may think that it serves their interests. So that's the core of the Electoral College.
And if you want more on that topic, May 13th and 14th, we will be doing a whole hour on that topic. We did pick that because we're so smart.
Well, I don't know about that, but we also had a really great discussion on the Electoral College just the other night with 2 Electoral College scholars, a part of the National Constitution Center's public programs, and that's on Zoom and on YouTube if you guys want to check it out. I learned a whole lot from it.
And I can send you guys that link too. So that's a good one to add, Jeff. So
Yeah.
real quick, Jeff, some of the compromises that were made that forced enslavement into the Constitution and to stay longer in our country. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, and then the importation of enslaved people.
So the Three-Fifths Compromise says infamously that enslaved people, for purposes of apportionment, count as 3/5 of a person. Where did that come from? Well, it was a formula that had been used in the Northwest Ordinance, and the basic idea, although it's incredibly degrading and an appalling violation of the equal dignity of enslaved people, the basic idea is that the non-slave states are thinking, hey, if these slave states get to keep slavery and also get to count their enslaved people for purposes of apportionment, they're going to win all the congressional seats and they're going to dominate Congress forever. So it was the northern states or the free states' attempt to minimize the bonus that the slave states would get from keeping slavery because there were not the votes to end it. And it's a tragic reality of the Constitution. The Constitution could not have passed without the slave states signing onto it. And that's why that compromise was in the Constitution. The importation clause was sort of on the other side. It basically said after 1808, you can stop more enslaved people from being imported forcibly into the United States from abroad. But until 1808, you can't stop that importation of slaves. So again, a kind of compromise, recognizing that after a certain point, the importation could stop. And indeed, in 1808, the importation stopped, but slavery within the United States did not stop. The question of whether or not the Constitution is a pro-slavery document is one of the most hotly contested questions in American history. Some say yes, including William Lloyd Garrison, who said that it was infamously a pro-slavery document. Others said no. James Madison said during the Constitution that the delegates had carefully avoided introducing into the document any language that there could be property in men. And when Lincoln read that in Madison's notes, which were published in 1840, he became convinced the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, as did Frederick Douglass, who read those words and said he changed his own conception of himself as a man and as a citizen. We're not going to resolve the debate about whether or not the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, but now you know a little bit about those two important compromises that ensured that it wasn't until the bloodiest war in American history, the Civil War, that we finally passed the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th guaranteeing equality, and the 15th extending to African-American men the right to vote.
Great. So ready to jump into the next big document, which is connected to the Constitution, one might say. When we look a little, jumping through all the people, we're looking at the Bill of Rights. So the structural Constitution is what you've been really addressing, and we can talk a little bit about the structure that it sets up with the Congress, legislative branch, and then the executive branch, and then the judiciary branch. So we do have to talk a little bit about that, but also introduce the next addition to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
Absolutely. So here's the first big question we have to ask. Why didn't the original Constitution contain a Bill of Rights? Today, so much of what we've been talking about in our conversations, friends, has dealt not with the structural Constitution, but with the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment. Later, we're going to talk about the Second Amendment. But the original Constitution had no Bill of Rights. Why not? Well, James Madison, who's often called the father of the Constitution because he had more of a role in drafting it than anyone else, said originally that a Bill of Rights would be unnecessary or dangerous. What was he talking about? He thought it would be unnecessary because the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights, he said. Because the Constitution enumerated or limited Congress's power, Congress would have no ability to exercise powers that were not expressly granted to it. In other words, Congress wouldn't be able to abridge freedom of speech because it was granted no power to abridge freedom of speech. It had enumerated powers in Article 1. That was Madison's first argument, that Congress had enumerated powers and therefore there was no need to specify all the things that the 10th Amendment says that powers not granted by this instrument are retained by the states or by the people. Then the second argument was that a Bill of Rights might be dangerous because someone might assume if the right wasn't written down, it wasn't protected against infringement. And Madison and the other framers believed with Thomas Jefferson, who was not at the Constitutional Convention, but they all shared this view, that our rights come from God or nature, not from government. Remember, that was the whole point of the Declaration of Independence. They don't come from being written down in a Bill of Rights. We have them, whether or not they are enumerated in a Bill of Rights. And Madison thought it would be dangerous if we make a list of 10 rights, some future citizens or judges or tyrant or king or demagogue might think, well, I don't see that right written down. It must not be protected. Now, the anti-federalists were not convinced by Madison's argument. The anti-federalists are the people who oppose the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists, led by Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington was a Federalist, and John Adams, all thought, let's keep the Constitution as it is and let's ratify it. The anti-federalists said, we're giving the central government too much power, the president could be like a king, and he might threaten our liberty, back to our central word. So 3 of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention refused to sign it because it had no Bill of Rights. And Kerry, I can't see the 3 anti-federalists.
Oh, I'll move. Well, you can't, they're in front of me. Yeah, I can see them.
You can imagine them. Absolutely.
They're my 3 favorites. You know that.
They are. They're heroes. They were George Mason of Virginia, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, and a man called Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Have you heard of the word gerrymandering? You guys, you've heard that perhaps from the Supreme Court. Gerrymandering is when people draw voting districts that look so funny in order to maximize the likelihood that incumbents will be reelected, that they snake around and they look like salamanders or some kind of weird animal. And that's where the word gerrymander came from, because Governor Gerry in Massachusetts was so determined to keep his party in power that he drew voting districts that looked like salamanders. They called them gerrymanders. Actually, I learned now that you pronounce his name Gary, so if you want to be really pedantic and irritate your friends, which I do not recommend, then you could
just like Gary. He was kind of a pedantic guy, so it works.
Oh, Gary, yeah. You could call them gerrymanders, but anyway, don't do that. Gerrymanders come from Elbridge Gerry. So these 3 guys, the anti-federalists, the refuseniks, refuse to sign the Constitution. They walk out and they won't sign it. And they say, we want there to be a Bill of Rights. Now, eventually, they're so persuasive that many of the ratifying conventions say, yes, we will ratify this Constitution, but we expect you to add a Bill of Rights. And many of them proposed amendments to the Constitution in the course of ratifying it. And in the face of this overwhelming public pressure, James Madison changed his mind. What an incredible virtue. Imagine a leader actually considering the evidence and also the political pressure he was under and changing his mind. So he went from opposing a Bill of Rights to accepting it. And Madison drafted originally 19 amendments to the Constitution. Congress proposed 12 of them, and 10 of them were ratified and became the Bill of Rights. Now, what should we say about the Bill of Rights? The first is that Madison wanted to make sure that people didn't assume that if a right wasn't written down, it wasn't protected. So that's why he included the 9th Amendment, which says the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So Madison is basically saying, don't do what I was afraid you might do if we included a Bill of Rights. The fact that I'm not listing it doesn't mean that this isn't a right that comes from God or nature and not from government, and that government is free to infringe. It's really interesting, isn't it, that there were originally 12 amendments proposed, not 10? We think of the First Amendment as first because it's the most important: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly. But the original First Amendment was not the one about free speech. We have that in the National Constitution Center too. That also is in front of Kerry in her virtual backdrop. And the original First Amendment would have required there to be 1 representative in Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants. If that had passed, friends, there'd be about 4,000 people in Congress today. It's a good thing it didn't. The original Second Amendment was not the right to bear arms. It's one that prohibited Congress from raising its own salary without an intervening election. That became the 27th Amendment in 1992. It was ratified almost 200 years later. Our original First Amendment was their 3rd, and it just happened to have been ratified first. If you want to learn more about the unratified amendments, go to the interactive Constitution of the National Constitution Center, and you can read their text. It's so exciting to see the amendments. The final one that James Madison thought, it's not the final one, there were, remember he originally had 19, but the one that he thought was the most important in the bunch would have prohibited the states as well as Congress from infringing the rights of conscience, press, and trial by jury. That didn't fail, and it took the 14th Amendment to incorporate or apply those rights against the states. finally fulfilling Madison's hopes. So that is a good introduction, maybe, to the Bill of Rights. Anything else, Kerry, on the Bill of Rights?
No, I think we really need to dive into the Federalist and Brutus #1, because I think that's harder for some of the students. So I want to dive into those documents next and give them enough time for questions. Even though I'm getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A, we are going to hold for a minute longer.
Great. So the Federalist Papers. Friends, they're so important. They're so inspiring. They were written by Alexander Hamilton, the rap star of the moment. We all want to know what he thought, and what, not only in the room where it happened, but also after the Constitution was proposed, when he and James Madison and John Jay wrote these essays to try to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. They're basically like essays in the newspaper or in a magazine about why you should ratify the Constitution, why all your fears about it are overstated, why it really will balance liberty and security really well. And Hamilton and Madison and Jay go through the arguments in favor of the Constitution very methodically. It's not easy reading, I understand, but it really is worthwhile to read it if you read it slowly. And I think what we should do, just because it's so important, is read the central language from Federalist 10. We'll read it together, and it's easiest when we take the time to read together. And here we go. And the central idea of Federalist 10 is the idea of faction. What is a faction? It is any group, either a majority or a minority, influenced by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. Remember I said with Teddy, you were asking about the pursuit of happiness, that they believed that our job was to restrain our passions with our power of reason in order to achieve personal happiness and self-government? Well, they also thought that was necessary for political happiness and self-government. And they thought that there'd be these unreasonable groups motivated by passion called factions, and that these factions had to not be allowed to coalesce and make laws because they would threaten liberty. Teddy, you were so right to keep bringing us back to liberty. So that's why the whole Constitution is designed to slow down deliberation, to prevent factions from forming fast and organizing and passing illiberal, terrible laws. And that's why at the beginning of Federalist 10, Madison's very first sentence says, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. That's what this whole essay is about, how the Constitution is going to slow down and break and control the violence of faction. And then he defines faction in the second paragraph. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. That's a long but crucial sentence. Let's go through that again, what the definition of faction is. First of all, it's a number of citizens, either a majority or a minority. That's so crucial. You can have a majority faction or you can have a minority faction. But either way, they're united by a common impulse of passion, an unreasonable perturbation of the mind, like greed, anger, or fear, or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. They're motivated by self-interest, not by the public good. They want to ensure the interests of debtors or of creditors rather than of everyone. They want to ensure the interests of the state of New Jersey, not of the whole United States of America. There can be all sorts of reasons that factions form, but the whole Constitution is designed to slow them down. And Madison says there are two ways of fighting faction. You can remove its causes or control its effects. Well, you're not going to remove its causes because it's natural for people to gather together, animated by passion. They get all fired up. So what the Constitution is going to do is control its effects, and essentially by slowing down deliberation, making it impossible for one branch to speak for we the people. You have to jump through lots of hoops to pass a law. Congress has to propose it, the president has to sign it, the Supreme Court has to uphold it. By the time a faction either tries to organize, either people won't be able to find each other, or by the time they do, they'll get so tired that the passion will peter out and they'll just go home. So a big part of Madison's theory is that the large size of America will control the effects of passionate factions. People will find it hard to organize over large periods of space, and when they do, passion will eventually cool because of all the speed bumps and roadblocks that prevent passions from coalescing into law. Friends, isn't it amazing to think about what would Madison have thought about Facebook? And
I was going to ask you, can you give us an
Yeah.
example of a faction that students may have seen today?
Well, sure. I mean, you can just say that Michigan group is a faction. To say it's a faction doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong, but those people who are bringing guns into the Michigan legislature, they want to open up Michigan right now because many of them are small business owners. They think their businesses are being harmed. But the aggregate and permanent interests of the community, at least according to the governor and the state legislature, require the state to remain closed. So that's a faction. You can see factions on Twitter every single day. Just look at all the people who are tweeting Trump is bad, or Biden is good, or more specifically, when anytime someone is a minority that has more voice than it would otherwise have. So the Bernie supporters had a big presence on Twitter. People thought that Bernie was really powerful just because his followers were making more noise than everyone else. As it turned out, he didn't end up winning a majority of the primaries. So that would be another example of faction. But the thing about Twitter and Facebook is that they make it easy for factions to form really fast. And once they form, to coalesce and not to go away. So Madison's confidence that given the large size of America, factions wouldn't be able to find each other, they would just get tired before they could do any damage, is completely challenged by these social media platforms. So this is a real challenge to the whole theory of Federalist 10. You won't, for your AP exams, probably be asked to ask what would Madison think of Facebook, but it's crucially important to think about it because he probably would have thought, hey, we need some other ways of slowing down deliberation in the age of social media so that factions are not able to do too much damage.
Got it. So we have a bunch more to get through,
Yes.
But Teddy and Nina and another person all said, what's the difference between a faction and a political group? So real quick, just that one, just because 3 people asked it.
There's no difference. A faction, it is a political group, but a faction is a majority or a minority political group actuated by passion rather than reason, self-interest rather than the public good. Now, Teddy and the rest, as you can tell, that's a pretty slippery definition. You could say that a political party that has the capacity of mobilizing citizens of different interests to consider the public good is not a faction, whereas a political party that just caters to its base and selfishly tries to keep getting reelected, even if the public good isn't served, is a faction. But that's all in the eye of the beholder, because the people in the other party would say, hey, we are serving the public good, you just disagree with it. So it's a slightly elusive definition, but it's a crucial one, and political parties definitely can be faction, and so can political groups.
Brutus 1, Federalist 51, Federalist 70. What do you want to go to next?
Well, let's quickly do the other Federalist Papers, Federalist 51 and 70. We'll put them on the table. And then I want to say a word about 78. And don't worry, we'll get through it all. Although I wish...
Say that with such confidence, 15 minutes.
Friends, I hope it was helpful to actually read the Federalist Papers. I know it's kind of rough to make yourself do it, especially while you're learning at home, but it's worth it. Take it from me. And even though it's not immediately, it's not easy reading, just kind of get through it. Maybe read it out loud. I know that seems kind of weird, but you'll get it if you can convince your friends. I know your parents would be really happy if you said, I want to read the Federalist Papers out loud. But if you read it together, you'll be able to teach them something too. I bet this, because I know this as a dad, I have, when I reread the Federalist Papers, I learned something new. So pick a Federalist paper that you like, one of these ones we're talking about, and read it out loud with your folks or your friends, whatever, and try to talk about what it means. It's really exciting. It's really worth it. Okay, so Federalist 51. It's basically the idea of separation of powers. And this was a critical idea in books like John Locke's Second Treatise and Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law. But the separation of powers came from Greek political theory, where Aristotle believed that there were three interests in society: the few, the one, and the many. And the few, represented by the aristocracy, could degenerate into oligarchy, or rule by the rich. The one, which at its best was monarchy, could degenerate into tyranny, and the many, which at its best was democracy, at its worst could degenerate into mob rule. So these three pure forms, each had a good form and a degenerate form, and the Greeks and Romans and Montesquieu and Locke were determined to create a government where each order was separated from the others so that no one could gain predominance. Now, the great genius of the founders was to take this notion of separated powers from classical political theory and to add to it the idea of checks and balances. Madison said, no, in fact, we don't want to completely prevent any branch from exercising any powers of the other. The executive can exercise powers with the legislature in their joint power to make treaties or to appoint judges and other officials. The powers are blended rather than completely separated, so that by blending and separating them, we can best ensure that no one branch can have all the power, but instead the power is dispersed as broadly as possible. So that was the first great contribution of the Federalists to political theory. The second was the idea of representation. The Greeks and Romans believed that a democracy would have to deliberate face to face in a big agora or in the Roman gathering places. The framers thought no, representative government could ensure that you could have a democracy even in a really big country like America, and that was their second great contribution. Okay, that's Federalist 51. Now we're going to note that our next Federalist paper, which is Federalist 70, talks about the executive power. It's written by Hamilton. Hamilton was often thought of as a monarchist. Do you know, friends, that he stood up in Congress and proposed during the Constitutional Convention that the president and Senate be elected for life? That's why his fellow delegates thought that he was a closet monarchist who basically wanted a king. And in some ways he did. But nevertheless, he thought the president's power should not be completely unlimited. He did talk about the need for a unitary executive to have accountability in government and energy in the executive. He says this isn't inconsistent with Republican government, because in the previous Federalist paper, he has just said in Federalist 69 that in many ways, the president of the United States has less power than the British king or the governor of New York. Remember 2 weeks ago, Governor Cuomo of New York was saying, hey, President Trump, you're completely wrong that you have total authority. I have some authority on my own. Well, Alexander Hamilton agreed with the governor of New York in that case. But Hamilton does talk about the need for a single executive. And this was a big innovation. It was James Wilson who proposed a single executive. And when he did, there were gasps and silence in the Constitutional Convention because people were so afraid of a king. Many of the states had had councils of executives of multiple people, but Hamilton creates a constrained but unified executive. Okay, that's Federalist 70. Federalist 78 is the very basic idea of judicial review. It comes from Hamilton again. Here's the idea. It's kind of, here you go. Hamilton says that how is it that judges have the power to strike down unconstitutional laws? No one elected them, they're appointed for life. How is that consistent with a democracy to have an unelected judge tell the people's representatives what kind of laws they can pass? Well, Hamilton says it's not actually anti-democratic, because it's the Constitution that represents the true will of the people, not the laws passed by our ordinary and fallible representatives. Why is that? Because the Constitution was passed according to this special ratification procedure, whereas an ordinary law can pass anytime majorities in both houses pass a law and the president sign it. They might be wrong. They might pass a law that either exceeds Congress's enumerated powers or threatens reserved rights. And therefore, Hamilton said, whenever there's a clash between the will of the people represented by the Constitution and the will of our fallible representatives embodied in ordinary laws, judges should refer the principal to the agent, the master to the servant. That's it. It's strong stuff. A lot to say about whether Hamilton was too optimistic in claiming that the Constitution represents the will of the people more effectively than laws passed by our representatives in the here and now, but that's his theory. And then the final thing to say about Brutus was that Brutus is an anti-federalist. We know who the anti-federalists were. They were people like Randolph and Mason and Elbridge Gerry. And Brutus is basically saying, guys, let's remember classical political theory like Montesquieu. He thinks that large republics are going to fail because it's natural in a republic to have only a small territory. In a large republic, there are men of large fortunes and less moderation. People will try to raise themselves to grandeur by flattering the people and sacrificing the public good. And in a small one, the interest of the public is easily perceived and more within the reach of citizens, and abuses can be overseen and checked. So Montesquieu is channeling the ancient Greeks and Romans and saying this democracy thing is not going to work if the country gets too big, because citizens aren't going to know that their liberties are going to be threatened and they won't be able to keep our rulers in checks. The majority is saying, don't worry, our new innovation of representative government combined with the checks and balances will ensure that for the first time in all of history, we can have this radical experiment, namely a representative republic that can thrive in an extended territory, and that is Brutus. That brings us, friends, to our last piece, which is the letter from a Birmingham jail. But before we get there, Kerry, questions?
Yeah, just a real quick clarifying question, which in the Q&A from Benjamin Fox, he wanted to just ask, did Hamilton mention the idea of judicial review, the words of judicial review? And I know that students are also being able to reference court cases. So I just wanted you to connect, I think it was Federalist 78 with the court case. So there you go.
Well, I can connect it to the court case, but Benjamin, what's the court case that I have to connect it to?
Answer that in the chat box.
Let's see, who's going to get it first? What was the court case that recognized judicial review? We talked about it a couple of days ago.
They got it.
You got it.
Yes, do so good on the test.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexander. I am Becky and Jeff, right. So Marbury versus Madison is the case that first recognizes judicial review. And Benjamin asks, do the words judicial review appear in Federalist 78? And I think they do not, although I'm going to just do a word search, Benjamin, to make sure that I've got that right. I'm typing in judicial review and I'm not getting it. So no, they don't. But it is more than implicit. I mean, some people say judicial review is implicitly accepted by the framers. Hamilton is saying in words too clear to be doubted. I paraphrase them, so I won't read them again. But it's quite obvious that he anticipated judicial review. There were courts that exercised judicial review before the framing of the Constitution. And essentially, there was a big debate between Blackstone and Coke on this matter. Blackstone and Coke were the two great British authorities. Blackstone thought that Parliament could not, the House of Lords could not strike down unconstitutional laws because Parliament was sovereign. But Jefferson, Hamilton, and other American framers said the US Congress is not like Parliament. It doesn't have the sovereign power. We, the people, have the sovereign power. And that means that Blackstone was wrong and Coke was right, and judges should have the power to defend the will of the people represented by the Constitution over the will of Parliament.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Now back to a fantastic way to kind of wrap up these documents. And I love this speech. Martin Luther King and the letter from the, it was not speech, the letter from the jail.
Kerry, I love it too. I have to say I read it for the first time in a long time before this class, so I could be ready to talk about it. And friends, it is so inspiring. And Dr. King is citing some of the greatest philosophers in history, including Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, where he says there's a moral responsibility to ignore unjust laws, for an unjust law is no king at all. He's looking to the biblical story of disobeying the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. He's looking to Hitler and Nazi Germany, who claimed that everything the state did was legal. And then turning to the present, he says that segregation laws are immoral and unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. We talked yesterday about Brown versus Board of Education and whether it created feelings of inferiority. King says so powerfully, it creates that feeling in the soul. And then he says that the civil rights movement is not extreme, it's moderate. Like other great reformers in history, though he realizes that moderation is not always called for. Jesus and other great reformers have been extremists, including Martin Luther, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. And then King quotes from the Declaration of Independence. It's so moving, and it's such a perfect symmetry to return in this great letter from Birmingham jail to the immortal words of the Declaration, which King also quoted on the Mall during his I Have a Dream speech, and insists that Jefferson's promise that all men are created equal must become a reality. And then King asks, so the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? And he reminds his audience, oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever, and the urge for freedom will come eventually. Wow, just so powerful, and reminds us that that promise of equal freedom, articulated in the Declaration of Independence, thwarted in the original Constitution in those compromises over slavery, resurrected by Lincoln at Gettysburg, achieved on the battlefields of Antietam and Vicksburg, and finally enshrined in the Constitution after the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction amendments, had to be resurrected by those freedom fighters during the Civil Rights Movement, galvanized by the inspiring words of Dr. King, so that in acts like the Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation, Jefferson's promise finally began to become a reality. Okay, final questions, Kerry.
So final question is actually one from Don from the beginning. And and it's perfect because we look at Martin Luther King referencing back to the, our Declaration of Independence and saying, have we lived up to this? Have we met it? But Don's question was about Indigenous people and Native Americans, and that being disconnected or connected with the Declaration of Independence as well. So I just want to thank you, Don, for holding on to the end, but I really thought it was an important question to pull together at the end when looking at these big ideas. And this is why these documents were pulled together, that you have these concepts over time in America and they ebb and flow, but we hold on to them. These ideas of all men are created equal, of popular sovereignty, of natural rights, and how do we marry these documents together and say, this is what we believe as Americans? So just ending with Don's great question.
It is a great question, Don, and thank you for it. And thank you, Kerry, for that powerful metaphor of the idea of freedom and equality ebbing and flowing. And Dr. King said that although freedom does ebb and flow, the arc of freedom bends toward justice. He thought that ultimately the Constitution was ever becoming more embracive, more perfect, so that it would include previously excluded people and bend toward justice. Don, the story of Native Americans is a tragic one. There is no doubt that they too were denied the promise of the Declaration of Independence. They were shamefully mistreated, both at the time of the framing and during the Jacksonian era, of the time of the Trail of Tears, where their treaties were broken, their people abused, their rights denied. And many of those indignities went on for much of American history. Some of them were remedied in the 20th century, but many of them could never have been undone. People whose land was taken away from them. We see in the Constitution a remaining signaling of the different status of Native Americans. Remember, the 14th Amendment begins, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. The framers believed that Native Americans on their own land were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and were not entitled to birthright citizenship, yet another indignity. Dawn, on either next week or the week after, the Supreme Court's going to hear a really interesting case about whether half of the state of Oklahoma should be considered to be deemed under land belonging to the Native Americans, according to previous treaty rights. If it rules for the Native Americans, then literally half of Oklahoma would be subject to guarantees made to Native Americans. Really interesting case, complicated case. So friends, here's what I hope you'll do too. This is such an exciting experiment. Starting on Monday, the Supreme Court, for the first time in American history, is going to live stream oral arguments. This is the first time you'll ever be able to hear the arguments as they occur. And the Constitution Center, we're partnering with C-SPAN, and you'll be able to sign on with us at Zoom or watch on C-SPAN, listen to the arguments, and then I'm going to get to interview advocates on either side of the case to explain the arguments we've just heard. These are complicated arguments. I'm going to have to study them too. We'll see, we'll all learn about them in real time. But what a thrilling opportunity to hear the justices and try to understand these important, complicated cases together. And that Native American case will be one of them. And Don, I hope you'll tune in and we can learn together about the arguments that it raises.
And we might have to do a recap before every 1 o'clock session, what happened that day too, just to make sure if you can't go to all of them, you'll get it somewhere.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you guys so much. Jeff, that was a great way to wrap it up. I'm so glad Don held on to that question the whole time.
Yes.
And everybody, we will send you out all the information, and we want to thank you all so much, and thank David for joining in and answering all the AP questions, and Nick for supporting us in the chat with all the constitutional scholar questions. So lots of fun going on in this session today. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Kerry. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.